It's Thursday, February 20th, 2025. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Senate Staff Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm joined today at the Wilmington Club by Professor Charles Elson. A native of Atlanta, Georgia, he is a graduate of Harvard University and the University of Virginia School of Law. After law school, he clerked for U.S. Appeals Court Judges J. Harvey Wilkinson III and the late great Elbert Parr Tuttle. He has practiced with the firms of Sullivan and Cromwell and most recently Holland and Knight. Professor Elson began his teaching career at Stetson University College of Law before being named the inaugural Edgar S. Woolard Jr. Chair in Corporate Governance and the founding director of the John L. Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware in Newark, Delaware. In addition to his distinguished career in law and academia, Professor Elson served for a time on the staff of Senator Herman E. Talmadge of Georgia, which will be the main subject, but not the only subject of our conversation today. Thank you so much, Charles, for taking the time out and hosting us here at the beautiful, historic Wilmington Club.
Where the law of corporations meets the senator from Georgia.
That's right. So let's start at the beginning. Tell me how the Elsons made their way from Albany, New York, not Albany, Georgia, to Atlanta.
And you pronounce it the correct way, Georgia and the one in New York. My grandfather was working for a news distribution business in Norfolk, Virginia, in the 30s and 40s, where my dad grew up, and my grandfather bought a business in Atlanta, same sort of business, that became something known as Atlanta News Agency. They were periodical distributors. And my dad was in college. Then they moved to Atlanta, 1953, when my dad was, I think, a freshman or sophomore at UVA, and we ended up in Atlanta. And my dad ended up going to law school in Emory, and ended up working for his father. And eventually, my grandfather retired, and Dad took over the business. And that's how I ended up at least in Atlanta. I was born and bred, so I know nothing other than Atlanta.
So tell me, was your family involved in politics, or was it just happened to be sort of tangentially involved to their businesses?
I think they're actually pretty much involved. During the Civil Rights era, my dad ended up as chairman of the Georgia Civil Rights Commission. Did a lot of, was involved in a number of political candidates. He was the treasurer of John Lewis's campaign, original campaign. He and, my parents knew Andy Young, the Lewises, and they were very active in that era in Democratic politics, but I think more on sort of the liberal side than the other side. But my father had a good friend. Actually, my grandfather had a good friend named Morris Abram, who was quite well known for litigating a number of county unit cases. And he was my grandfather's lawyer and a very close friend. And Morris Abram, oddly enough, was a good friend of Herman Talmadge's. And somehow,
strange bedfellows.
Strange, and they were opposite politically, but they got friendly. And my dad was introduced to Senator Talmadge by Morris Abram. I mean, this was probably, I'd say, sort of in the mid to later 60s. And they turned out they just happened to become good friends. They liked each other. They were very different politically, very different in background and in tone, yet they just really enjoyed each other. And when my dad was on the Obscenity Commission, which was in the late 60s, he would, I think, sometimes stay with the Talmadges when it came, and they just happened to be odd sort of friends. And Talmadge was one of the great, people in Georgia politics. My dad certainly wasn't, but they liked each other. They had a similar sense of humor, and they had fun, and that's as I recall.
When do you remember? How about this? What was your first memory of the senator growing up?
Once I can remember he and Betty Town. I remember going up to the farm with my dad as a kid. They at one point invested in real estate together, Dad was sort of little pieces of property here and there, and Dad would, I think, go out and find them, and they would, the Abram and Talmadge, my dad would invest in it, and they, I don't remember them selling anything for years and years and years, but I think they were buying land on the south side, and Atlanta happened to go to the north side. But nonetheless, I can remember going out to see them. He and Betty Talmadge in Lovejoy as a little kid. Years and years ago. And I can remember, they coming over the house, once in a blue moon on a Sunday afternoon, and sitting outside and having lunch with them. But that was Dad's friend, not my friend. And they seemed to they laughed a lot. They liked each other, and they would tell stories back and forth. And it was always fun listening to them because he was a legend. Mm-hmm. My dad, as I said, was not, but he was. And they just happened to like each other.
Now, were you involved in political campaigns or interested in politics?
Not at all. A little bit. I can remember in 1968 sticking Humphrey signs up around the neighborhood on telephone poles. But no, I really wasn't. I was always interested in political history. Sure. That fascinated me. Certainly Georgia history as a kid was just always really interesting. There were such colorful people. And, growing up during the Civil Rights era, it was even more interesting because a lot of those figures who became national figures were really local figures in the sense that, certainly John, Lillian Lewis were around, Eddie Young, all these people were sort of in my parents' generation. And then obviously Jimmy Carter became governor. Dad had been a supporter of Carl Sanders, who was considered the liberal governor of Georgia, who ran again in 70 and was beaten by Jimmy Carter.
Very tough campaign.
Very tough. Though Dad got to know the Lances Lance well. They were in a group called the Young Presidents Organization, YPO, and the Lances came from a different part of Georgia. He was Calhoun, Georgia. Yeah. Mom and Dad were obviously from Atlanta, but in that era, those who were in YPO were kind of old Atlanta, old Southern, and so Mom and Dad initially just didn't know that many people in there. And when one day they came in, and there was another couple who was new, and Dad looked at my mom and said, "See that couple over there? That's us 2 years ago. Let's go be friendly." And they became good friends. And obviously Burt Lance became highway director, and then went on to other things. So in Georgia politics, it wasn't that big a place. Right. You kind of, you knew one, you kind of knew a lot of others. Like I said, my folks were very active on the D side, Democratic side.
So you did your studies up at Andover, like your father.
Yes, sir.
And then went to Harvard. What was it like as a Southerner, as an Atlantan, going up north to New England?
Very weird, in the sense that very few people, if anyone I knew, went away to school from Atlanta. I think when I first decided to do it, my friends thought I was going to reform school. That I had done something really wrong. I was being sent there. But it was, for me, a wonderful experience because the school Phillips Academy was phenomenal, but from a history type like me, it was one of the great places in American history. George Washington, his nephew, went. He addressed the group on horseback. The buildings were designed by Bulfinch, who designed the U.S. Capitol. The stuff and history were fascinating. And
you said Washington's nephew. Is this Bushrod?
You would know, but it was his. That's a great. I don't which
Supreme
one.
Court Justice Bushrod.
That might have very well have been it, because there's a George Washington Hall in honor of the fact that his nephew spoke on horseback. Gotta be. But it was anyway. It was a neat place to go, and. Great experience. I think that from up there weren't that many students from the South in that era there. So, you got all kinds of questions. But that was the era when Jimmy Carter was elected. And in 76, when Jimmy Carter, was running for president, suddenly a Southerner, particularly one from Atlanta, became very valued in conversation. Because everyone wanted to know, who is this guy? What's he like? And that summer, fortunately, I had spent summer of 76 working as an intern in Senator Talmadge's office. and which was sparked by a paper I wrote the year before.
So the
about
paper
Talmadge.
came before.
Yeah, there was Senator Talmadge when he was way back before he was Governor Talmadge was the son of obviously Eugene Talmadge, former governor, famous former governor. Wild Man from Sugar Creek, as the book described him. And I had heard about this in my own sort of readings and whatnot, and I thought, wow, this would be an interesting thing to write a paper about it. And in Andover, your junior year, you took a very well-known American history course, and part of the deal at the last end of the course is you had to do an original research paper on some topic of original interest, which was, my school was quite a bit. It was a big deal, and you had haul basically half the year to do it. And I discovered this little story about Herman Talmadge becoming basically running for, his father ran for governor, was elected governor, died before he could be sworn in, and Herman Talmadge claimed to be governor, along with a fellow named M.E. Thompson, and Ellis Arnold refused to leave the office. Ellis Arnold was a lawyer in Atlanta with whom I was familiar, Arnold Golding Gregory, and kind of a legend. Talmadge was still a legend. Talmadge was a legend. M.E. Thompson was not a legend, but nonetheless, I wrote this paper, and I wrote or tried to reach each of the protagonists who were still alive. And I went to meet Talmadge. I remember going up, and I remember meeting Ellis Arnold. I think I still have a tape recordings of those interviews, and M.E. Thompson. And it was a great paper. It turned out it was really well. It ended up getting published by the Atlanta Historical Society in their Atlanta Historical Bulletin, it was called then. And got a little prize, won a prize for it at Andover. But Talmadge and I just I enjoyed him. I thought it was fun hearing the story and challenging him a little bit on parts of the story. And he said, I have an internship in the summer, would you be interested? We bring in a number of interns each summer, and you're a little on the younger side, because at that point I was, it was in high school, late high school. And I said, boy, that'd be great. And that's how I ended up there the summer of '76, which was also the year that Jimmy Carter got the nomination, ran for president, and won. So it was a particularly unusual time for a Southerner to be in Washington.
So what were you doing as an intern? I have visions of coffee and Cokes and telephones, but
no, it was some of that, but really it was a lot more. They put us into different areas. You do constituent services, somewhere in the press office. I ended up doing some stuff in the legislative area and writing bill briefings. One was on something called Russell Long was pushing for something called an ESOP plan, or tax deduction for creating something called an ESOP, employee stock ownership plan. And I had to write the memo on the thing. I think Talmadge already agreed to do it, but I had to write. Yeah, they were friends. Talmadge was obviously on finance with Long, and I had to write this. They call them the legislative memo on the thing. It was interesting and research, and it turns out later in life, the knowledge of that turned out to be quite helpful, because the area I ended up into, corporate governance, had a lot to do with the ESOP. And I said, oh yes, 1976, rep tax bill, this is where it came from. It became famous in the takeover era, as a takeover device. Anyway, but I remember doing that. It was another on the New River bill, which was a bill that was preserving part of the oldest New River, which was the oldest river in the United States, or so it was said. And it had to do with preventing development and sort of working on power distribution for that. And there were a couple of memos and a couple of bills that were coming up. I remember once having to bring a deceased Georgian back from Spain. That was weird on a weekend. That was, but
every day a new adventure.
Every day a new adventure. But it was an interesting office, and it was a very close office. There were, I'd say maybe 10 interns, and were scattered around different parts of the office for the summer. And everyone lived kind of in and around Capitol Hill. And you got really friendly and close to a lot of the staffers, from Rogers Wade to Russell King to Dan Tate. And it was fascinating, just as a kid, who was interested in this stuff, watching how it actually worked, how law was in fact made. And the senator was actually pretty good about that. I mean, he would take time and would talk to us. You'd go to his office and he'd sit down with you. And he didn't spend a ton of time, but enough that you got a good sense of it. And you got to know the folks in the Senator Nunn staff too. They were basically, around the corner, so to speak.
Right.
And so you just got to know a lot of people from the Georgia delegation at that time. And it was a great summer, and certainly from a history type, I was in hog heaven, so to speak, because Talmadge at the time was a very significant senator.
Mm-hmm.
Vice chairman of finance, chairman of agriculture, and a lot of people who worked for him at that time ended up going to work for Jimmy Carter.
Right.
And from Max Cleland, who became the head of the VA, Dan Tate was obviously head of congressional liaison for Carter, and there were just a ton of folks affiliated with Talmadge who went on to the White House with Jimmy Carter. So it was just like one of these great times to be there. I liken it to working as an intern in the White House in 1965 for Lyndon Johnson. I had a professor in college named Alan Brinkley.
Yeah.
Brinkley, who since had passed away, but he was there. His dad was the TV David Brinkley, and he was actually in the White. And I remember as a student of Brinkley saying, "What a great time to have been there." And I think the Talmadge thing for someone from the South was equally time-wise fortuitous.
I can still remember reading as a grad student Alan Brinkley's The Problem of American Conservatism.
That would be
how historians cannot get conservatism right.
Yeah, that would be. He was a great professor. He was a sort of
age
reform. He didn't get tenure at Harvard. He didn't get tenure.
Not unusual for historians in the Ivy League.
No,
not unusual.
No, he didn't, and he ended up at Columbia. Had a brilliant career there. Became provost of Columbia, but he was a Frank Friedel student, and we shared the same common professor. Friedel was the political historian at Harvard, and Alan Brinkley was his guy.
So would it be fair to say that you either caught or avoided Potomac fever during your summer in Washington?
I caught it, but I ended up avoiding it.
You were inoculated.
I was inoculated. Well, I went back a couple of summers.
Yeah.
I went back. I spent the following summer, 2 summers later, once working for Max Cleland at the VA, who I'd known with Talmadge. Then I worked for in the White House for Dan Tate, Congressional Liaison Office. And then I took a twist.
Yeah.
My politics took a twist. And I ended up at the American Enterprise Institute for public, and that was right before Reagan, summer of '79.
Okay.
And so a lot of the folks who became Reagan folks.
So Baruti would have still been.
Baruti was there. I mean, this was, in fact, it was the original Baruti. The father was still around and there. And the number 2 director of administration was a fellow named Rogers. Rogers is now number 2 at Goldman Sachs. He became he's a big deal, John Rogers. Mm-hmm. He was the administrator. There was, Jim Miller, who became head of OMB. There was the woman, Jean Kirkpatrick, who became the ambassador to the United Nations. I worked for Ben Wattenberg and David Gergen that summer. And it was, Ben Wattenberg was kind of known. The real majority. He was fun. And then his sidekick was David Gergen, who at that point had left the White House and was rumored at the time to have been deep-throated in Watergate. He wasn't, turns out. But he became a good friend, and we haven't kept up.
I grew up watching him on CNN.
Really?
Yeah, David Gergen.
David Gergen,
All
really?
the cool kids watched David Gergen.
Really, David Gergen? Because he was, at that point, he was just, a guy there.
He come out of Ford's White House.
He was out of Ford.
Yeah.
He was with Nixon. He was working for Ray Price, and he left and then went back. I think he sensed something was wrong, and he came back under Ford. And then he ran Public Opinion magazine, and then he ultimately left and went to work for Bush. But then that didn't work out, and he went to work for Reagan, the Reagan White House.
I think he may have even spent some time in the Clinton White House.
He did. Yeah. As a matter of fact, he did. After Reagan, he changed parties, and he ended up with, he was on ABC for a long time, but he ended up working for Bill Clinton. That's absolutely right.
Gergen's like whatever the opposite of a neocon
Right, yeah,
David.
David.
The neocons were liberal Democrats.
Right.
Who moved.
He was, yeah, and he was kind of the other way around.
Yeah.
But his dad, I think, was a math professor at Duke.
Oh. Wow.
It was, interesting, background, and it was fun to work for. I really enjoyed David Gergen, and when he went to work for Reagan, I said, well, gee, could you have an internship? He said, no. He said, you're in the wrong party. And I said, well, and then of course later I felt like saying when he went to work for, hey, what are you doing there? You're in the wrong party. But anyway, he was a good friend, and it's been a long time since I've seen him. But he was interesting. So yes, I had the fever, and then after AEI, I guess I got to the point that I wasn't as enthusiastic about politics as I found.
Right.
It didn't, the experiences I had were interesting, fun, but I was worried about making a career of something like that because it didn't seem real to me. And
what do you unpack that for me? What do you mean when you say it didn't seem real?
Well, I think that politics. Well, I'll give you an interesting example. I had a good friend who went to work for a governor, and the work I did was very involved in the corporate scene on some boards and things like that. And I remember calling this friend, and he said, "Oh yes, I've had so and so company was in here, this company was in there," and I said, "Well, actually, yes." I said, "And no." I said, "They were probably the government relations person, and they wanted it." He said, "Exactly." I said, honestly, they aren't the corporation. Corporations are very different. They're economic vehicles that create products or services that create value. You are dealing with a representative, but in the political business, the assumption is I'm at the top of the heap, and therefore the big company is seeing me. Not really. The power and the stuff of the country wasn't necessarily in those governing the country, but it was actually in those who created and manufactured the products or services that in fact created the economy. And I guess after AEI, and having seen too, a lot of people kind of come and go in that business. Senator Talmadge in 1980 lost re-election, and that was that. He never came back again. And I remember going to his house to interview him for my senior thesis in college. I wrote my senior thesis on him. And I remember he was sitting there and the phone rang. And he answered, he goes, hello? And he goes, yes, this is he. And he said, yes, ma'am. No, I feel pretty good. No, I'm doing just fine, but thanks for calling, and I appreciate the concern. He said, the woman called me, heard I was dead. It was so fun. It was so sad. Here was this person who was certainly one of the most powerful political figures in Georgia, who also was, nationally incredibly powerful. And within 2 years, they thought he was dead. He was sitting in his house, sitting on an easy chair, answering the phone, would be sitting there, and it just convinced me that kind of life was not the kind of life, though I was interested in reading about it, writing about it, studying it, that just wasn't for me.
So you told me an interesting story earlier about how you were going to be a historian.
Yep.
Went to graduate school for history or American studies.
Yeah.
But decided to diverge, take the diverging path and study the law, and you're so much poorer for it.
Totally. I'm sorry I'm not a historian, though. I was in a PhD program, and what had happened was I wrote my thesis on Senator Talmadge, and the idea was looking at Talmadge's career as a measure, as a way of looking at Southern history in that period. That Talmadge's career reflected, through telling his story, I thought you could tell the story of the New South. And from the beginning of his career, really to 1980, till it ended, that was through the lens of Herman Talmadge, you could do the South. And my thesis advisor at Harvard was a guy named Frank Friedel, who was the Roosevelt biographer, and he said that would make a great thesis, book, great dissertation. But at that time had been admitted to UVA Law School, and I was going to go to law school. And he said, why don't you put that on hold for the year? Come here and do the program. So I put law school on hold. I came back, but at that time he was retiring from Harvard and going to the University of Washington. The man who was taking his place was David Herbert Donald, Southern political historian. And Donald agreed to take me on as a student. And so I came back to work with Donald and theoretically write this thesis dissertation. Donald changed gears in that middle of that summer and became interested not in Southern political history, for which I had taken his courses at Harvard and did well and liked him, but he decided the history of the South would be in literature. And the program I was in was American civilization, but my specialty was going to be political history. Instead, you had a minor in legal studies, and I picked what you could do and I said, I'll do the American legal history. And I was going to go to the law school and work for a man named Morton Horowitz, Mort the Tort, who was a legal historian at the law school. But he said, don't do that. You've already been here long enough, undergrad, you'll be here another couple of years. Go somewhere else for a year in law school. Take it and then come back. And I thought, well, that makes sense. I had UVA, so I went to UVA figuring I'd go for the year and then come back to Harvard. And Donald would have hopefully changed tunes by then. But I got to Virginia, and I really loved what I was doing. I just really liked law school, which is weird. So I went on leave for a long time from that Harvard program. Put the thesis on ice, still have microfilm of all the stuff I had found, and ended up going to law school. So, but always enjoying the history of, in the law, I liked the historical antecedents. I just thought it was interesting, and it explained a lot of how we ended up doing certain things.
Well, when you got to law school, you said that you really enjoyed it. What was it about law? Was it a certain person or a certain class that really spoke to you, or was it just this whole idea of following precedent and the context of this case leads into the historical context?
I think it was a combination of things. I really enjoyed the back and forth of class. I thought the Socratic method was a hoot because they didn't grade you on it. I mean, you could argue all you wanted, but the exams were secret. Your identity was secret, so you could say anything you wanted. And I liked the back and forth. And the professors were really good, and they made you think. I mean, law teaching, it forced you to think logically. You have to break down, start all over again from what you came in with. I came in as a history/political science type. I had to totally start over. A new language, new skills. I was taking a corporations course my second year, and I taught by a young professor who became dean of the University of Chicago Law School. And I found myself I wanted to be a constitutional lawyer. I didn't know.
I was wondering with the clerkships that you did.
Yeah.
Why you didn't take that constitutional law?
Well, I thought I'd like it, but I didn't like it as much as I thought. I didn't like con law, but I took this corporations course, and I found that sitting there, I could predict where the professor was going next. And he would ask a question, and I'd raise my hand, and I'd say, yes, but aren't you really talking about that? And he called me after one class, had come down, and he said, I'm a little upset with you. And I said, why? He said, you obviously have the notes from last year, and you're skipping ahead. And I said, I don't have any notes. I just kind of had a feeling you were going that way. And it turns out I really loved the course, but I thought, I want to do litigation. And I had a summer in New York at Dewey Ballantine as a litigator. And then I had a clerkship for Jay Wilkinson. I thought I'd like to do it. I ended up clerking for Judge Tuttle. But in the end, I just liked the corporation stuff more. I ended up going to Sullivan, which was a corporate law firm, and I, for some reason, just liked the stuff. I don't know why. Didn't take it in college, never thought I'd like it, never took an economics course, but some reason it clicked. I liked the logic of it. Heck, that's why I happen to be, we're talking in Wilmington, Delaware, the home of American corporate law. And I don't know. It was just something strike you. And so I put all that on hold and went to the corporate route. after clerking. But clerking for Tuttle
Yeah.
and Wilkinson were fun. Wilkinson had been a writer, a political science type writer. He wrote some phenomenal papers on the bird machine in Virginia while he was at Yale.
His father was very instrumental in breaking the bird
That's
machine.
correct.
Civil rights.
That's exactly. His father was the head of a well-known bank,
Mm-hmm.
and Jay was my federal courts and criminal procedure professor, and he was being nominated for the Fourth Circuit while I was in law school. He had been the editor of the Norfolk Virginian Pilot from Richmond, had gone to Yale, was Justice Powell's first clerk, was an avid writer, and we just had a lot of common interest. And he asked me to be his first law clerk. And so I was I was still in law school, but we arranged, it was sort of an internship clerkship where I was writing a paper about it, but I was down in his chambers a good chunk of my third year. And ended up then clerk for Tuttle.
So you did the more formal post-graduation clerkship with Judge Tuttle.
Yeah, what had happened was I spent the summer at a place called Dewey Ballantyne, where I was originally signed to litigation, hated it, ended up in the bond department. And there was
what a time to be in the bond
department.
In the 80s.
Yeah, it was funny. And there was a guy there who was my summer, sponsor or whatever. And in those days, at Virginia, you applied for clerkships at the end of your second year. And if someone called, made you an offer, you had to accept immediately.
Ooh.
And Wilkinson, at that point, hadn't been confirmed. His nomination was held up by Senator Kennedy and Senator Metzenbaum. And so the question was he going to get confirmed or not? And he didn't know. No one knew.
Right.
So I was encouraged to apply to other judges, but they wouldn't get back to me for a long time. And by the time they did, he would have been confirmed and it would have been done. Well, it turns out I sent the thing in, and within like a week, I get a call from Judge Tuttle in Atlanta. You must have seen Atlanta in Virginia. And he offered me a job on the spot. He didn't interview me. He said, Charles or Charlie? I said, whatever you want to call me.
Whatever, Judge.
He said, I frequent, it's number 2. He said, I'm considered pretty left of center. Would you feel comfortable clerking for me? I said, sure, I'm a civil libertarian. And I said, okay, what's the 3rd? He said, can you start August 5th, next August 5th? And I said, excuse me, is this an offer? And he goes, yes, it is an offer. I said, well, can you give me a couple of minutes? He said, I didn't realize your application was in doubt. I freaked out because Virginia said once you got offered it, you had to take it. But I had this Wilkinson thing I was waiting for. I didn't know what to do. And I went to the fellow I was working for, who had been a law professor before he went and became a very famous bond lawyer. And he said, if you call right back there and you call him and you accept on the spot. And I said, why? He said, for God's sakes, it's Judge Tuttle. He said, my worst mistake was turning down a clerkship with John Minor Wisdom.
Oh.
He said, and I didn't, and that was a mistake. Don't make that same mistake. And he said, and if you don't accept it, I said, what happens? He said, don't expect a job here. So I went and accepted, and then as it turns out, Wilkinson got confirmed shortly thereafter. And so we figured out a deal where I would work for him my 3rd year and then go with Tuttle in the normal course. So the funniest thing, Tuttle was at that time 88.
Yeah.
And I was worried, gee, well, it's 2 years from now, will he still be around?
So he was already a senior judge.
He was senior judge, and he had 2 clerks, and, he was quite well known, but I'm like, wow, that's not young. And I'll never forget, I went to the life insurance tables, and it turns out if you get there, you got a really good shot of going beyond. Anyway, while this was going on, I got another call from another judge who was on the D.C. circuit. And he said, I said, well, I'm sorry, Judge, I've already accepted Judge Tuttle. And he said, he's you like him, he's a great guy. And this man was A, a lot younger, and B, on the D.C. circuit, which was a great place to go, fast, supposedly. Anyway, I forgot about it, and I went with Tuttle after Wilkinson, which was great. And I was there maybe 3-4 weeks, and my law school roommate, a Georgian, Dave Worley, called and said, you are the luckiest guy alive. I said, why? He said, did you read the paper this morning? I said, no. What? He said, Judge Tam died.
Oh.
The DC said, if you had gone there, you would have been stuck. And instead, Tuttle, not only survived my clerkship, but lived to about 100.
Yes.
So I was even part of his alumni group for some time thereafter. Meaning, who knows? It was a great experience. And as a Southern history type, Judge Tuttle was absolutely fascinating. He was an amazing, brilliant lawyer. Great writer. He'd been a newspaper man, so his writing style was terrific. And he just had more amazing stories about the South and that period with Talmadge and all the things that I'd been interested in up to that point.
Did you ever share with him your interest and your research into Southern politics?
Oh yeah. And we, it was interesting when it was fascinating. Judge Tuttle was considered one of the great liberal civil rights judges,
right.
And he was a very courageous man. He had been wounded in Japan, the Second World War. He was an amazing man, a lot of courage, political courage, judicial courage. He took some very tough stands and stood by them. But it was interesting because Wilkinson was considered a conservative, and Wilkinson was attacked very much so by Kennedy and others. He had been Brad Reynolds' deputy in the Reagan Justice Department. And it was interesting because Jay, as it turns out, as a judge, has been a phenomenal judge, I think very middle of the road. And if you knew Jay, you'd know that he really was a very balanced individual. And he called them as he saw them. He was, in fact, a civil libertarian.
Not an ideologue.
He wasn't an ideologue at any stretch. And on a personal level, he was. He's a very open, shy, but a wonderful person. Judge Tuttle, who was considered the great civil rights judge, was a man of his time. And I remember he was a member of a restricted social club in Atlanta. And I would argue with him about it. Why you of all people? And his response was, well, my wife didn't want me to leave. And I thought, that's a tough one. Because, and I remember Judge Wilkinson refused to join such organizations. Now, this was a long time ago, and that wasn't. Today, it's really not an issue. But back then, it was an issue. And it was amazing to me that Wilkinson, who was considered, attacked as being so quote unquote conservative, in fact, on a personal level, was very liberal. And the judge, who was considered very liberal, was personally not quite the same. And I remember writing, when he passed away, I wrote his obit, or his memorial for the Cornell Law Review. And when I wrote it, this was, I don't know, 1990 something. And I put into it a line, I'll never forget, that said, it was just tiny, but said he was a great liberal, but man of trade courage. And I remember, though a man of his era, he XYZ, suggesting that he was human. He was courageous. He made tremendous changes in the South, but he was, he was a human being, and he had his own background and thoughts and whatnot. And I remember I sent it around, and his first law clerk and law partner, now deceased, called me and said he was the only one who picked up on that. He knew, and he said, "Do you think you could take it out?" And I said, "I don't know. I mean, I think it does." I said, to be honest, historically, you really have to tell the story. It's true, but now we didn't get into what it meant. It just, he knew what I meant, but in the end, I think I watered it down a little bit. But I just thought it was interesting to me. It didn't detract from Elbert Tuttle as a person, as a judge. It was basically, he was a man of his era, like it or not. Jay Wilkinson was a man of his era. He grew up many years later, in a time where that sort of thing was unacceptable. But in Tuttle's era, it was. And I think that Herman Talmadge, you have to view him in that way too. that it's easy in contemporary standards to judge someone by our standards, but they may have grown up quite differently. And while today you may seem way out, in that era, it really wasn't. And Tuttle was a very courageous man. I mean, gosh, the death threats he got, the shunning he received for what he did. He was an amazing and courageous on the battlefield too. But everyone is a little different, and he was like, I wanted to paint a picture that was flattering because it should have been, but also a little realistic. It's like some of the old jokes about paintings of J.P. Morgan. He had some disfiguration on his face. They always got rid of it. Oh, he didn't look like that, but he really did. And an honest portrait that's him. That's who you saw. And I think that's what I tried to do there.
We discussed at lunch, since you brought up the Talmadge Project again. We spoke over lunch about how your goal of trying to understand Talmadge while at the same time understanding the New South or the New South, whichever New South we're on or he was in, through that lens. Try to unpack how, because you had known him as this legendary figure, what were the complicating factors in his life that made him a more interesting politician, whereas his father, what you see is what you got. You got the demagogue, you got the rabble rouser, you got the wild man from Sugar Creek. But Herman Talmadge's story is much more complex, and in a way, because he was on the political scene so long, he sort of evolved with the South. What did you find in your research?
Well, precisely that. Well, you remember, he ran his father's campaigns, which was very interesting. And he came back. He went over. He was in the Navy in the Second World War, and I think that was a very important experience for him, because where his father's life or life in the going up to the governor's mansion or life was very insular. The war, I think, had a huge impact on a lot of people of his generation. Now, A, it was dangerous. B, you were somewhere far away, and you were interacting with people you never would run into under your. And I think it changed his view of the world. And he came back, and when his father ran again in '46, which was the controversial election where he first got into politics, really, he was pushing his father to the left on a lot of political issues. And he'd come back from the war, and he was beginning to envision a rather different South than it was his father's. It was new generation, and he pushed him in ways that was unexpected. And when he became governor, he did things that were frankly unexpected vis-a-vis his father. He was, I wouldn't call him a great progressive liberal governor, but he certainly was much more so than you would have typically thought. You had, he instituted an income tax, he increased education spending, all kinds of stuff that, were pretty dicey for him coming where he came, from which he came. But you also have to remember at the same time, that was Brown v. Board, 1954. And I remember finding a copy of a book that he wrote, and I had the dickens of time finding it, called You and Segregation.
Yes, sir.
It was published by the Vulcan Press. I still have a copy of it. And I remember as a college, sophomore, starting to research this thing and reading this book, and the Vulcan Press from Birmingham, Alabama, and it was pretty rough by certainly 1980, 1979 standards. So I was like,
pretty
whoa.
rough by 1955.
And probably rough by 55 standards too. But then it was interesting because I remember working for him, and the contacts that he had developed within the African American community, both in Atlanta and statewide. He was one of the first senators, I think, to address the Hungry Club in Atlanta, which was an all-black political group that was a lunch group. And they asked him, why haven't he come before? He said, well, you never asked me, which I thought
very, very politic response.
To respond. But he had migrated from 1954, 55 to by the 70s, he was a very different figure, and that's why I thought he was so interesting. Some of characters from his era never migrated. Senator Bilbo never migrated. Senator Eastland never migrated. Senator Thurman, who knows? He just got old. but the rest, he moved beyond that and became very respected. And pretty well liked across the spectrum. He was a friend of Lyndon Johnson's, which I thought was interesting. Worked with him. He was much more complicated than the story was, and I thought he was a great figure to write about the South. That through the changes he was experiencing from his childhood till he comes back from the Navy, and what he was pushing led to the economic development of the South. And that they were pushing economic development as a way to float all boats. And as all boats were raised by the economic success, good things theoretically were going to come out of it in a region that had historically been very economically depressed. That was interesting to me, how he did it.
Why do you think Talmadge, and this is a question I've often asked myself, why do you think Talmadge has not been remembered by a broader audience in the way Strom Thurmond or George Wallace or some of the other major figures in Southern politics have been remembered?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think he never had national exposure because he was very much a behind-the-scenes guy. He had a line I'll never forget. It was funny. He was talking about Frank Church, Senator, not Church, it was not Frank Church, it was a senator from Connecticut.
Ribicoff?
No, this was the child, not child, it was the fellow who was the, no, it was senator who was the heir to the pharmaceutical fortune. It was, I can see him, oh gosh, what was his name?
So as we were saying, Senator Lowell Weicker.
Well, Senator Lowell Weicker, he said, he was talking about him, and he said, beware of any man who demagogues behind closed doors. It was a great line. I'll never forget it. And he said, in other words, when you're in private, you can really have a conversation. And those who demagogue in private aren't worth fooling with. He was a behind the scenes, get it done guy. And I wouldn't call him a great speech maker. He wasn't. He wasn't a great orator, but he was effective because he was so smart and kind of funny in a very dry and wry way, but brilliant. And he knew exactly what he was doing. And I think his popularity was really limited to within the Senate. He became kind of famous during the Watergate hearings because he was on the Watergate committee with Lowell Weicker, and he was not necessarily telegenic, but he was pretty good, and he suddenly became known. But then he kind of receded back to where he was. He wasn't a demagogic orator. He wasn't a limelight taker. He'd walk down the street, you wouldn't know who he was unless you knew Georgia. He knew, the old joke was he knew half the state personally and the other and a relation of the other half. And so he was remarkable that way. He was very friendly, very outgoing, but I think personally very shy. But he grew up around that, and he seemed extroverted, but he wasn't at all. He would always talk to folks. He would stop. Who are you? How are you? I used to see him. It would joke that it would take him 20 minutes to get 3 feet from the inside of a door into the room because he would talk to everybody. Hello, how are you? Nice to see you. How are you? It would take him to get from one point to another, long because he was literally talking to everyone. Old retail politician. But he wasn't a telegenic, and I think that's why he didn't attract the same attention that let's say even a Lowell Weicker would have attracted.
Or Sam
Sam Irvin, who was a
chair,
who became a legend of this. Talmadge was a workhorse, not a show horse. He used to always complain about the other senators not doing their homework. He said that so and so he never does his homework. Lazy. He wouldn't say lazy, but import that he was saying they were using their staff, not themselves, and he had disdain for that. He was a man who got up at 3-4 in the morning. He was always in the office before anybody else, and he worked hard at it. And he was not a show horse. A workhorse, as George Busby used to say.
The great campaign slogan coined by our friend Judge Norman Underwood.
Yes.
So, how much of this, you're talking about these qualities, his personal qualities, sort of the introvert, the quiet, the shy, the better in small settings, which is all true. How much do you think, at the height of his popularity, which would have been, and not just popularity, but renown, would have been 74 with Watergate, how much of that was his personal struggles that came to light really after his son Bobby drowned and passed away, and then the brutal divorce between he and Betty, and then the ethics, sort of cascading.
I think I remember when his son died. I remember when Bobby died. I was in Andover at the time. I think I was in 10th grade. Was I in 10th or 11th? Anyway, about the time I was writing the paper about the three governor controversy, and I heard it was reported on the radio that Senator Talmadge died in a lake, in a drowning accident in a lake. I thought, oh my God, he died? I remember calling my folks, oh no, it wasn't him, it was his son, it was Bobby Talmadge. And it affected he and his wife terribly, because that was between the two, that was his two boys, that was the one who was supposedly going to replace the father, was going to, as Joe Biden had to his son who passed away here, Beau Biden, it was the same relationship, and both died young, tragically. Bobby Talmadge died in a boating accident, drowned. And I think it took the stuffing out of him. And I think it took the stuffing out of both of them. And I think at that point, he had no successor. He was starting to age. And I don't want to say he gave up, but his focus was, I assume, different than it was years before. There was no, what were you going to do next? There was no one to say, I'm going to pass the dynasty, my father passed it to me, I'm going to pass it to my son. It was done. And I think that had to have an impact on his own psyche, whether it was alcohol or whatever. It had to.
Well, we talked about how Talmadge really hasn't been remembered outside of Southern scholars and Southern political scientists and historians. But how should we, in Charles Elson's view, remember Herman Talmadge and his contributions to whether it be American law, agriculture, finance, Southern politics more broadly?
I think that the economic development of Georgia and the development of the New South, oddly enough, had a lot to do with his influence and his direction. I think that he was a behind-the-scenes power broker. You look at New York, you had Robert Moses, who really built Manhattan. No one ever knew. I mean, in his era, he wouldn't walk into a restaurant and, oh my gosh, it's so-and-so. He wasn't a Hollywood type. And neither was Herman Talmadge. He looked just like Walter Matthau.
Yes,
people say, what do you look like? He looked like Matthau. And if you listen to Matthau, he sounded like Talmadge. I always thought if there was ever a movie on Talmadge, they would have gotten Matthau. Problem is, Matthau died, Talmadge died. We'll never get it. But they were very similar.
Maybe the powers of AI.
Maybe the powers of AI. But he did kind of look like. And Talmadge would, you'd see him come in. He liked to go hunting. He liked to go running in these boots. He was a character. I remember once going to a thing. It was after Jimmy Carter won, and they were having I think it was at Burt I think the Lances were having a party for a number of people from Georgia before the inauguration. It was at the Florida House. They called it the Florida House. It was on Capitol Hill, and it was black tie. And I remember Talmadge walks in with a suit and a dark tie. And someone says, "Senator, so see black tie?" He goes, "Well, that's what I got on." It was, you had to know him. It was just total him. He wasn't a showboat. He was just who he was. But I think his impact was that he was so connected, that he was much like Richard Russell, that a lot of good things came to Georgia because of him. He was a very extremely effective representative. Was he a national politician? No, he wasn't. He didn't like foreign aid. It's interesting today, the whole controversy over USAID. I keep thinking back to Talmadge and some of the lines he used to. If it takes you $1 to make a friend, keep the dollar. If it costs you a friend to keep $1, keep the friend. And that was his response to foreign aid. It was funny that even that has kind of returned into vogue. He wasn't. He was a national figure or nationally interested that way. He was a senator, but he was really focused on Georgia and the development of Georgia. And I think Georgia has become a significant economic player today. And you and I were speaking about that. A lot of it had to do, I think, with the groundwork that was laid by Herman Talmadge as governor and as senator. He was a powerful senator. In the Ag Committee and Finance Committee, he was a big deal. And he did tremendous amounts for the state. And a lot of as I remember, a lot of the state people would come in to see him. We were there. A lot of the, not that's the governor, but a lot of, I don't want to say the underlings, but those who had political influence would come to see him for advice, for a favor, and, favor in the sense of for the state or for their region or for their locale. He was good, but funny, very dry sense of humor.
What would you tell young people, or not so young people, maybe not high school students, but those who may be interested in interning like you did on Capitol Hill or taking a junior staff position on the Hill? What advice would you give them with the proviso that the Senate and Capitol Hill in 2025 is a very different place than it was in 1975, for example?
I would take it in a heartbeat because I would say two things. A, I'd take it in a heartbeat because you're going to learn so much practically about the way law is made. I think what you learn, and what I learned then, that on television and the newspapers, people are painted as having very diametrically opposed positions. And everything is starkly presented. This, left, right, up, down, good guy, bad guy. And what you learn is that the way to get things done in life is to work with people, that people are neither as good as you think nor as bad as you think, and that it's really about compromise and working together to get to a common goal. Talmadge would work to get to a common goal. You have to remember that was also the era of the Panama Canal Treaty. Remember?
Right.
And that was very controversial in Georgia, to allow it or not allow it. The giving away the canal. It's come back, oddly enough, today. And ultimately, a compromise was worked out. And it wasn't this or that. And I think spending a summer on the Hill, or an internship, if you really pay attention, you learn that that's how in life you get things done. That it's not throwing the gauntlet down. I mean, look, there's going to be issues in life where you're going to have an integrity call. And you're going to have to either keep your integrity or not. And obviously, my advice was, keep the integrity, forget the other. But you learn that politics, you can get to the right result and still keep your integrity. And Talmadge, I think that experience for me was wonderful. I decided I did not want to go back to Washington in the end, as I didn't like the way things were done. However, I learned, in life, when I was looking at it, understanding that the other side isn't necessarily bad, or not necessarily terrific. They're somewhere in between, and the key is working with them and learning how to be friendly. And you can learn just as much from them as they're going to learn from you. In the Hill, you'd make friends from very different offices, and the senators would be friendly with each other, even though they really, on the floor would attack them. They would sneak off and have a drink in one of these little secret hideaways at the end of the day, or the senators of the small dining room. It was interesting, and that's a good lesson. Whether you make a life of it, I couldn't. I just thought it had a downside to it. I didn't think it was real, but it was fun.
Well, how did you apply those lessons that you learned in your brief time? How have you applied them, or if you have applied them in your subsequent legal career? Whether it's how you deal with corporate governance, or working on corporate boards. Are there lessons that can be applied?
Total and complete, absolutely. The lessons are that that it's interesting. In a boardroom, you have to work together with people, and the only way you're going to get things done is you will compromise. The question is, how far do you compromise, and if you compromise your ethics or integrity, you're done. You can't but you're never going to get everything you want. The key is, you have a group of people with differing goals. How do you take them, identify a common goal, and work together to get to that goal? And that's a lesson that came out of that office. I thought, at least for me, and I was 16 at the time, and it has stayed with me ever since. And you pick up a newspaper and someone is vilified in a paper. You meet them, they're actually rather different. And you can't let someone else's view of someone influence you. You have to, you certainly you'll hear about it, but you have to, meeting them one-on-one, it may change the equation. And I've been involved in hiring a lot of CEOs. I've been involved in firing some CEOs. And I think a lot of what I pulled out of that summer, oddly enough, still applies. It was amazing that it could be that. What shocks me is I think of the summer of 1976 as yesterday. And in fact, from this era, it's over 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Almost 50 years ago. It's remarkable. I can't believe that. I mean, 50 years, that's an overripe bottle of wine.
Well, you have formally retired your full-time teaching position. What have you been up to in your post-retirement? Any plans to pick up this Talmadge biography?
That's a great. I still have the stuff. Oddly enough, I wonder if
I know where you can get more.
You want really? I can imagine. But I spent a lot of time in the Russell Library. I spent a lot of time in the archives, state archives, the Georgia archives.
Yeah.
And I still have the microfiche. I wonder if it survived. I mean, I have a box. It's in there with the copies of some of the Georgia news. I had all these.
Send it down to.
I'll bet,
send it
yeah.
to me at Russell Library.
I'll just dig it up.
Yeah.
But because it was interesting. It would have been fun to have done it, but things. The funny thing, after Talmadge, actually the book was done. Mm-hmm. He found someone else to write it. I thought they did a nice job. And Talmadge describes, he said to Charles Elson, he said, "You would have done a better job." I always laughed. No, I wouldn't have, but that was funny. I mean, he said, "You would have." I think he expected me to do it. I just never did. But since finishing, really retired from teaching.
Yeah.
But the nice thing of retiring from a specific school is you can do visitorships, which you couldn't do when you were at one place. They just wouldn't let you do it. So I taught the M&A course at Penn Law School. I'm on two boards, corporate boards, one on a special litigation committee involving a case that is quite significant in the law business, involving something called Caremark duties. It's an ice cream company called Bluebell Creameries, and it's a very famous case. It's a significant brand of ice cream, but it's a famous case on corporate compliance and board oversight. I just went off that board about a week ago, and then on the board of a company called Inhabit Healthcare, which is a spinoff of what was HealthSouth, I went on that board as it was kind of a famous board because it was a company whose CEO was indicted, went to prison, and I was part of the cleanup crew. And that was, but it fits in my, I edit the Directors and Boards magazine, and I write a column for them each issue on different governance issues. And each of those experiences over the years has really been helpful. And, you know, sort of, as an academic, you can look at governance issues theoretically. It's nice to have that practical experience that sometimes either proves the theory or blows it out of the water. So, you know, hence going to Washington and watching sausage being made.
Well, since I have you here, and as we wrap up, my favorite television show of all time, well, probably The Simpsons or King of the Hill is my favorite.
Very
but for our purposes here, Succession. Since I have an M&A guy here and a corporate governance guy here, you could probably write books on this. You know, the series basically revolves around a family, but more importantly, control of the board.
That's correct.
Of this massive corporation.
Yes.
Totally not News Corp. Not at all.
So they say.
So they say. So they say.
Don't ask the Nevada judge.
That's right. And the series ends with an acquisition.
Right.
By totally not Elon Musk.
Yep.
What has a show like that done to the popular understanding of how boards, and especially corporate boards of publicly traded companies, but with major family stockholders operate?
Well, you
and
know,
how real it is.
You have to remember this: family businesses don't operate as normal economic vehicles. In the case law, there was a famous Delaware case involving Ringling Brothers Circus, and there was a family dispute, and it had to do with the Ringlings. One of the husband of one of the Ringlings went to jail as a result of a circus fire in Hartford, Connecticut. It was he was accused of he didn't start it, but it was negligent in the way the tent was built. He went to jail, and apparently the others didn't visit him or something, and it created this huge rift in the family, and the circus basically stopped at one point on who does what. It was they were almost deadlocked, and there was confusion about who would be elected to the board, who wouldn't. And it was it was a psychological family issue influencing economics. That's what you see in family-run businesses, or family-dominated businesses. And that's the problem with those businesses, and particularly where you have something called dual-class stock, which you have, by the way, in News Corp and others, where you have a smaller economic interest than your voting interest. You saw that at Paramount. You see that at a number of families. You see it at Google. You see it at Meta.
Was that Sumner Redstone?
That was Sumner Redstone. That you have, let's say, economically a 10% stake in the company. Your voting control is 90%. You see that in Facebook. And what that does is, by giving you that much control, it injects into something more psychological than economic, because your interest and voting interest isn't aligned with your economic interest. And in family businesses, you see that all the time. Comcast was such a company. The New York Times, such a company. Washington Post, such a company. And it was extraordinary because it separated rationality. In a normal public company, where you have a number of directors, the give and take is much more economically related. You know, and the debates are: do you think that's a good idea, or is that a good idea? In a family business, very different. It's whose kid gets it next, or why do two cousins not get along? And they're very hard. I've done a lot of work with family businesses over the years, and they're the toughest of them all, because you've got these human emotional issues that affect ordinarily a normal operation of a business. And that's why dual class companies, I think, are very dangerous for outside investors, because you have Zippo control, which is why there's a controversy in Delaware today over controlled shareholders, controlled companies. And what latitude does the law give to controlling shareholders, and what protections do controlling shareholders are basically used against controlling shareholders to protect minority shareholders. Huge controversy in the law right now. and important for the investing public. Not something Herman Talmadge got involved in.
Not so much, but you know, if he had stuck around on the finance committee long enough,
Could have he would have been, could have been.
You know, we would our friends, you know, the late great Dan Tate or Russell King would have been working on those briefs. And,
That's true. They were the takeover era. I would have been interesting to have seen what Talmadge would have done
Yeah.
in the takeover with the icons of the takeover artists of the period. How he would have reacted in the '80s, because remember they changed the tax law around a lot of that, and what he would have done. I don't know.
Right.
He wasn't a corporate lawyer.
The Drexel Burnham era. And
How would have he reacted?
Herman Talmadge and Gucci Gulch. There's the title for you.
I can't. Not the way he dressed. No.
Well, thank you so much, Charles.
Thank you.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you again for the invitation to come to Wilmington. This has been absolutely fantastic.